This is News for Scotland, week ending Friday, 9th of February. It's news where we are.
Hello and welcome to News for Scotland. This is Yvonne Alexis, standing in for Hugh, who's currently in China. This morning, Michael Matheson, the Scottish Health Secretary, resigned prior to the publication of an investigation into how he racked up a nearly £11,000 bill on his work iPad. Mr Matheson, who made this announcement 3 hours before he was due to make a statement on raising the minimum unit price for alcoholic drinks in Scotland by 30%, said he did not want to become a distraction. Mr Matheson was being investigated by Holyrood authorities after admitting that his sons had used his iPad to watch football matches on their Christmas holiday in Morocco, running up a £10,935 data roaming bill. In his resignation letter to Humza Yousaf, Matheson told the First Minister he had still not received a report from the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, which began its investigation last November. Although separately it was reported that he had been given a copy of that investigation and that it contained new evidence about his conduct. Matheson had originally claimed that the iPad bill was so large because he had not realised his SIM card was out of date and no longer in contract, but insisted it was a legitimate parliamentary expense. At the time, Holyrood officials accepted his word and agreed a structure of payments which would include £3,000 coming from Matheson's office expenses and the remainder being funded by Parliament. Subsequently, he revealed to MSPs in November that his wife had previously told him that his sons had admitted using his iPad at a hotspot to stream a match between bitter rivals Celtic and Rangers on that January date. First Minister Humza Yousaf said he accepted Matheson's resignation with sadness, but that it was best for him to step down now to ensure that the parliamentary process is given the attention it deserves without distractions. This happened just a day after the resignation of Elena Whittam, the Drugs and Alcohol Policy Minister, who stepped down after revealing she was suffering from post-traumatic stress, alongside increasing pressure on the Scottish Government over waiting list times. New analysis shows that funding for the Scottish Government's NHS, recovery, health and social care portfolio is currently set to fall by 0.7% in real terms in 2024-25, compared with this financial year, despite official budget documentation showing a 1.3% real terms year-on-year increase. The official figures do not include in-year top-ups to health and social care funding added since this financial year's, that is 23-24, budget was originally set. So current plans are for spending next year to be lower than actual spending this year, which suggests we can expect a top-up to the Scottish NHS budget before next winter, potentially by cutting back spending in other areas. It's a similar story for local government. Budget documentation shows funding for councils increasing by 6.2% in real terms in 2024-25, compared with the amount originally budgeted this year. But after accounting for this year's in-year top-ups, the actual planned increase in councils' funding, including from council tax, is closer to 1.8% in real terms. The situation facing the Scottish NHS and councils is likely to be even tougher than these figures suggest, as their costs are set to rise faster than general inflation, 1.7% according to the GDP deflator measure traditionally used to calculate real-term changes in public spending. For example, the national living wage is due to increase by 10%, and the Scottish Fiscal Commission is forecasting overall public sector pay growth of 4.5%. These are among the findings in the first pre-release chapter published today from the Institute for Fiscal Studies' second annual report on the Scottish budget. A second pre-release chapter also being published today looks at the outlook for the Scottish Government until 28-29. Unless the UK Government increases funding, this will be another tough period for public spending in Scotland, despite extra revenues from devolved income taxes expected in 25-26. On current plans, annual growth in public service spending in Scotland between 24-25 and 28-29 will be just 1% per year. Even modest growth in health spending would lead to curbs in other public services. Of course, the UK Government could ride to the rescue. It seems more likely than not that increases in UK Government funding will turn out to be higher than the Scottish Government and the Scottish Fiscal Commission currently assume. On the other hand, the Scottish Fiscal Commission says that the net contribution of income tax revenues to the budget is more likely to be lower than higher than currently forecast. The full report with statistical analysis and forecasts can be found on the website for the Institute for Fiscal Studies. A new report led by the University of Glasgow has revealed 244 people have died while detained in custody or under the control of the state in a 1-year period in Scotland. On average, 4 every week. The research, which is the first of its kind to be carried out in Scotland, found most of these deaths occurred while people were detained under the Mental Health Act, that's 144 of them. 39 died after having contact with the police, and 38 died in prison between September 2022 and October 2023. A further 14 looked after children died during the same period. 4 people died in detention centres for migrants or in housing for asylum seekers, and 3 people with learning disabilities and autism died in hospital, while a further 2 died in police custody. Authors of the report, Nothing to See Here, Deaths in Scottish Custody 2023, which is published by the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, said many of these deaths are going unnoticed. Sarah Armstrong, Professor of Criminology at the University of Glasgow and co-author of the report, said, "For the first time we are able to see the number of deaths across a range of settings for which the state has responsibility. Every week, just in Scotland, 4 people die, deaths that largely go unnoticed and by far happen to and affect families with the least power. Each death is a tragedy, but what makes it a public concern is the responsibility of the state for people's care. Given this, one would expect robust and public methods of investigation. Sadly, this does not seem to be the case for most deaths." The research team also investigated 22 fatal accident inquiries, which are mandatory for people who have died in custody. 20 involved a death in prison, 1 in police custody, and another in migration detention. They found that more than 3/4 of FAIs took longer than 2 years to complete, and a third took more than 3 years. More than 90% of inquiries concluded with neither a precaution nor a system defect recognised, which is consistent with previous year's findings. Researcher and co-author Betsy Barkas said, "By looking at these specific FAIs, we have learned harrowing details of the final days and hours of prisoners, including a young man who resorted to calling 999 from his cell because he was having a mental health crisis. Emergency services then tried to contact prison staff to carry out a welfare check, but no one picked up for 1 hour and 20 minutes. Even after speaking to emergency services, prison staff didn't carry out the welfare check, but confiscated his phone. He was found hanged the following night." The sheriff who presided over the fatal accident inquiry concluded that the care provided to this prisoner was competent and compassionate, and his death was unavoidable. No findings or recommendations means that there were no lessons to be learned, or to put it simply, there's nothing to see here. Professor Armstrong added, "These are not one-off cases, but rather part of a worrying pattern." Frontline workers across Scotland suffer almost 60 attacks every day, new figures have shown. NHS workers endure the worst, with around 31 incidents per day in hospitals and health centres. Meanwhile, police officers suffered 18 assaults a day, with 6,657 cases recorded in 22-23. The figures, showing an average of 58.2 attacks per day, were obtained by 1919 magazine, a monthly justice and social affairs publication. The magazine highlighted a knife attack in which a man was jailed last month for 12 years for the attempted murder of a police officer and assaulting 2 others during an incident in Glasgow in October 2022. A female officer subsequently left the force due to the trauma. As well as the attacks on NHS staff and police, Scottish Government figures showed that there had been more than 500 convictions under the Protection of Workers Act, which created a specific offence of assaulting, threatening or abusing those working in retail. In the 11 months to November 23, there were 2,233 alleged incidents recorded under the legislation, the equivalent of roughly 7 a day. There were 279 assaults on prison officers in 2023, up from 178 the previous year. The The Post Office persistently pursued two sisters, Jackie L. Cassady and Rose Stewart, for a £34,000 discrepancy, even after a criminal trial was ruled out due to issues with the Horizon computer system, a system built by the Fujitsu company. In November 2012, it was mistakenly found that their accounts were down by more than $34,000 at the Gorbals post office. Jackie said when the auditors turned up, the seeds of shame were planted that day, and that's when my world, the life that I was living, that was changed that day. The post office investigators hunted the sisters down, despite Glasgow Prosecutor Fiscal Angus Crawford concluding in 2014 that no trial could be pursued due to issues with the computer evidence. Eventually, a mediation process was brought about, led to the post office requiring the sisters to pay £10,000 to settle the debt, which had severe consequences. This included the loss of the jobs at the Gorbals post office where Jackie and Rose worked and enduring mental health challenges. Mr. Cleghorn, their advisor, said that they should have been notified of the concerns over the Horizon computer system and pointed out that the withholding of such crucial information from a formal mediation process in order to extract money should be investigated. As is widely known now, the post office scandal was responsible for wrongful convictions all over the UK, with multiple former post office workers being accused wrongly of discrepancies in the accounts which were caused by glitches in the computer system the post office had implemented, despite faults being found during trial periods. As a result, many individuals lost their jobs, their incomes and their reputations, despite being innocent, and some ended up in jail. Yesterday evening, the BBC aired a disclosure programme looking specifically at the post office scandal in Scotland. The Scottish justice system undertook various actions such as apologising to victims, overturning convictions and assessing past cases for potentially faulty evidence. One such story discusses the case of Karen Lorimer, who was diagnosed with cancer in November 21 and died 4 months later before being able to clear her name. Karen's family and others affected by the post office scandal continue to fight for justice. The Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission has invited victims of a miscarriage of justice, including the family of Karen Lorimer, to apply to see whether their cases can be referred to the Court of Appeal.
This is News for Scotland, week ending Friday 9th of February. It's news where we are.
Hi folks, Jeanette Hill here. Going to do a wee report on power. The campaign group 38 Degrees are asking us to sign up to their campaign for a windfall tax on energy companies. They cite Shell's newly announced profits and how they made $22 billion last year. They link this to the millions who have energy bill debt, which they say has now hit a record high of $3 billion in the UK. This coincides with the removal of constraints on energy companies for the foreseeable future on installation of card meters. Enforced installation of card meters, I should say. The process was stopped in February 23 after a bit of a scandal attached to Centrica, about bailiffs and warrant officers forcing their way into people's houses to put in these meters. These meters are set with higher rates to pay off any debt and effectively cut people's power off if you don't have the money on the card. They are also set at paying back debt higher than a court would allow when taking account the income people have to live on, because any court that's asking you to pay back debt has to take into account income and expenditure and sets the how you pay the debt, the rate that you pay the debt accordingly. So 38 Degrees states, we can't let energy giants like Shell, BP and Centrica keep raking in profits while ordinary people languish in debt, caused by rising prices. And indeed these prices have risen. Most people are now paying at least double their pre-COVID energy bills, and for some it's triple. The perfect solution exists, they say. We could cancel all $3 billion of energy debts with a real iron-tight windfall tax on energy giant profits. It would take just 13% of Shell's 23 profits alone to wipe out the debt. So far, it's been everyday consumers like us footing the bill, and it's time that the shareholders and energy giants started paying their fair share. Which political parties have committed to a proper windfall tax, and will it work? In May 22, the present Westminster government did introduce the Energy Profits Levy, which brought in $2.6 billion. Shell, for example, paid $500 million to this in 23, a drop in the ocean, some might say. Centrica paid $1 billion in tax to it, and $54 million of this was in the levy. BP and Shell, like all companies, also pay corporation tax. However, both firms received more money back from the UK government than they paid every year from 2015 to 2020, with a blip there for Shell in 2017. Shell also paid a negative amount of tax in 2021, taking its 2015 to 21 UK tax total to $685 million. In January 23, Shell announced that it would pay UK tax for the first time since 2017. BP paid more money in tax than it received back in 2021, taking its total for the same period to minus $107 million. Understandably, it's a tricky business getting energy companies to actually pay up. Unlike those families in debt, where it seems quite straightforward, legal and easy, meters in homes charging extortionate amounts for essential energy is the way forward there. Ofgem has set a code for such behaviour for the involuntary installation of prepayment meters, as they say. And this code is now mandatory for the big energy companies. It includes conditions under which the meters are installed and when they shouldn't be, such as if they have children under 2 or all occupants are over 75. Or there's certain requirements people have for certain medical equipment. It makes for scary reading, however, this code. For example, the idea that you can have no energy when you need it to keep your essential medical equipment going. And it doesn't include things like you need a fridge if you're a type 1 diabetic who has to keep insulin in it. That's not included in their code. Or you have little children, say the youngest is 2.5, and it's 3 below zero outside. Or you've got a chronic condition such as heart failure or arthritis, again not covered by the code. But the cold will certainly make these medical conditions very difficult to live with and even dangerous. Hopefully this code will be adhered to as well, and there'll be no repeat of Centrica's British Gas-owned debt collectors breaking into people's homes to enforce installations. Given these contracts will be farmed out to smaller collection firms, it does seem a difficult area to police, and an already weak Ofgem code might not be enforced as well as it should be. Energy poverty is ever growing, the National Energy Action Charity states, due to reductions in household incomes, surging energy prices, and relatively modest improvements in energy efficiency levels. The number of households in fuel poverty across the UK is 6.5 million. The Scottish Government passed a Fuel Poverty Act in 2019 and recognised the amount of people that we may have in Scotland who are living with fuel poverty. They also recognised a definition of fuel poverty. They have now tasked the WISE group to manage much of these government initiatives, and they're hoping to reduce fuel poverty to 5% of the population. This is indeed a good target, hoping that their initiatives can set this out. These include looking at rural initiatives and looking at initiatives to improve the energy efficiency in houses. Meanwhile, the debate on oil and its companies continues, whether or not those in need in our cold country get the benefits of any of their profits. Indeed, the oil giant behind Rosebank, Equinor, announced it made a staggering $29 billion in profits last year. A Norway state-owned oil giant will get a $3 billion tax break to open the Rosebank oil field in the North Sea. The UK public will effectively cover 91% of the costs of developing the Rosebank oil field. Rosebank is mostly oil for export, so it won't lower the bills for UK households. The environmentalist group Stop Rosebank says Equinor also happens to be Britain's biggest gas supplier. While the world burns and millions of UK households struggle with soaring energy costs, Equinor and Norway make obscene profits from pouring more fuel on the fire. Who knows where this will end? Will we, in an energy-rich country, be able to give energy to our populace without it costing the earth? Who knows? First, I think you have to have the political will to make that happen. So Stephen Flynn, the MP and leader of the Westminster Parliamentary SNP group, on Peston on the 31st of January politics programme on ITV, seemed to accept the likelihood of a Starmer-led Labour government when Sunak finally calls the next election, and the SNP hold of 43 out of a possible 59 he hoped for again. He also discussed opinion polls and SNP prospects at that election. He corrected Peston, who seemed to suggest a Labour victory meant a defeat for SNP, by saying, of course, SNP only stand in Scotland, so could not prevent a Labour victory in Westminster. But this discussion then went on to talk about the balance of power in Westminster and whether SNP could influence this in a similar way to the DUP in previous Conservative-led parliaments. Indeed, they gained a lucrative deal for Northern Ireland through their balance of power voting. Flynn stated that he hoped we would retain all 43 seats and maybe even make some more gains at the next election. The YouGov poll of mid-January suggests Westminster results will be similar to the Tony Blair Labour victory of 1997, when they won 418 seats and John Major's Conservatives took 165. The 2019 election results were that Labour held 202 seats, the Conservatives held 365, SNP held 48, and 11 went to the Liberal Democrats, 4 to Plaid Cymru, 1 to the Greens, and none to the Reform UK party. This current YouGov poll predicts that for 2024 election, Labour will win 385 seats, Conservatives 169, Lib Dems 48, 25 will go to the SNP, 3 to Plaid Cymru, 1 to the Greens. And again, YouGov predicts that the Reform UK party will fail to win any seats, just like their predecessors, the Brexit Party and the UKIP Party did 2019 and 2017. So, as Peston suggested, SNP would fall from the third largest party in Westminster to behind the Lib Dems and therefore losing their balance of power position. In fact, should this arrive, the Lib Dems might be called again to support a Labour government, like they did with a Conservative government, rather than an SNP alliance. It is fairly clear, in my opinion, which would be a better position for Scottish politics. Let's look at who runs YouGov. Well, Stephen Shakespeare and the future UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadim Sahih, formed YouGov in the United Kingdom in May 2000. In 2001, they engaged a BBC political analyst, Peter Kellner, who became chairman, and then from 2007 to 2016, the president of YouGov. In April 2005, YouGov became a public company listed on the alternative investment market of the London Stock Exchange. An alternative poll discussed by the newspaper The National on the 12th of January comes from Redfield and Wilton Strategies. It predicted that both the SNP and Labour would win 35% of the vote at a general election in Scotland, and the Tories were far behind both parties on 17%. The Lib Dems pulled at 9% and the Greens at 2%. Reform at 2%, and other parties were a combined 1%. They said the general election race between Labour and SNP in Scotland was too close to call, and we shall see what happens. But the argument for a heavy Scottish presence holding the balance of power in Westminster is, to me, an interesting one. So Stephen Flynn, the MP and leader of the Westminster Parliamentary SNP group, on Peston on the 31st of January politics programme on ITV, seemed to accept the likelihood of a Starmer-led Labour government when Sunak finally calls the next election, and the SNP hold of 43 out of a possible 59 he hoped for again. He also discussed opinion polls and SNP prospects at that election. He corrected Peston, who seemed to suggest a Labour victory meant a defeat for SNP, by saying, of course, SNP only stand in Scotland, so could not prevent a Labour victory in Westminster. But this discussion then went on to talk about the balance of power in Westminster and whether SNP could influence this in a similar way to the DUP in previous Conservative-led parliaments. Indeed, they gained a lucrative deal for Northern Ireland through their balance of power voting. Flynn stated that he hoped we would retain all 43 seats and maybe even make some more gains at the next election. The YouGov poll of mid-January suggests Westminster results will be similar to the Tony Blair Labour victory of 1997, when they won 418 seats and John Major's Conservatives took 165. The 2019 election results were that Labour held 202 seats, the Conservatives held 365, SNP held 48, and 11 went to the Liberal Democrats, 4 to Plaid Cymru, 1 to the Greens, and none to the Reform UK Party. This current YouGov poll predicts that for 2024 election, Labour will win 385 seats, Conservatives 169, Lib Dems 48, 25 will go to the SNP, 3 to Plaid Cymru, 1 to the Greens. And again, YouGov predicts that the Reform UK Party will fail to win any seats, just like their predecessors, the Brexit Party and the UKIP Party did 2019 and 2017. So, as Peston suggested, SNP would fall from the third largest party in Westminster to behind the Lib Dems and therefore losing their balance of power position. In fact, should this arrive, the Lib Dems might be called again to support a Labour government, like they did with the Conservative government, rather than an SNP alliance. It is fairly clear, in my opinion, which would be a better position for Scottish politics. Let's look at who runs YouGov. Well, Stephen Shakespeare and the future UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadim Said, formed YouGov in the United Kingdom in May 2000. In 2001, they engaged a BBC political analyst, Peter Kellner, who became chairman, and then from 2007 to 2016, the president of YouGov. In April 2005, YouGov became a public company listed on the alternative investment market of the London Stock Exchange. An alternative poll discussed by the newspaper The National on the 12th of January comes from Redfield and Wilton Strategies. It predicted that both the SNP and Labour would win 35% of the vote at a general election in Scotland, and the Tories were far behind both parties on 17%. The Lib Dems pulled at 9% and the Greens at 2%. Reform at 2%, and other parties were a combined 1%. They said the general election race between Labour and SNP in Scotland was too close to call, and we shall see what happens. But the argument for a heavy Scottish presence holding the balance of power in Westminster is, to me, an interesting one. The Refugee Council of the UK is a charity working with refugees and people seeking asylum across the UK since 1951. It followed the creation of the UN Refugee Convention after the refugee crisis which was seen during World War II and its aftermath. The UN Convention of 51 and the added Protocol of 1967 are the main international legal documents used by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR, which was established in recognition that refugees are amongst the most vulnerable people in the world. They state they are dedicated to saving lives, protecting rights, and helping people build futures forced to flee their homes due to conflict or persecution. The core principles of the 1951 Convention includes a refugee should not be returned to a country where they face serious threats to their life or freedom. The document outlines the basic minimum standards for the treatment of refugees, including the right to housing, work and education while displaced, so they can lead a dignified and independent life. It also defines the refugees' obligations to host countries and specifies certain categories of people, such as war criminals, who do not qualify for refugee status. In addition, it details the legal obligations of the states that are party to the Convention, of which the UK is one. The Refugee Council of UK state on their website, "We exist to support and empower people who have fled conflict, violence and persecution in order to rebuild their lives here in the UK." They currently work with over 13,000 women, men and children each year who are desperately seeking safety. From the moment refugees arrive in the UK, they provide crisis advice, mental health counselling and practical support to help people settle and integrate into their new community. They state, "We are specialists in working with refugee children who arrive in the UK alone. We work with refugees and our partners to fight for improvements to the asylum protection system here in the UK. We inspire changes in attitudes towards refugees and people seeking asylum, speaking out for compassion, fairness and kindness. As a college lecturer in Scotland, I have seen the Refugee Council support asylum seeker students on numerous occasions. They support with legal help and advice to negotiate the complex procedures, including the gruelling Home Office interviews, and for some, the years in the system before status is confirmed. They support, too, people denied applications. They support with training or getting people into college, so when their status is confirmed, they are ready to take up work opportunities and contribute to the UK, as so many want to do and indeed do. Currently, only 3% of all people who come to the UK come through the refugee system. The Rwanda initiative, where we will process people to Rwanda, or a policy where anyone arriving by small boats will automatically be denied access to the asylum-seeking system, are considered by many to be a smokescreen to cover failure of Conservative policy to reduce immigration, as they stated they would with Brexit. The argument for Brexit was control of borders, so a points-based system was put in place. But this has not in any way decreased immigration. In fact, it is now at record levels, as The Guardian reported. Peter Walker and Patrick Butler's report using ONS figures in November 23 showed net migration to the UK has hit record high levels. So it seems the scapegoating of desperate people coming in small boats may be viewed as a predictable Conservative smokescreen to cover a failure of their Brexit ideals to reduce immigration. The question of whether we should stop immigration is of course very debatable. Notwithstanding this, our current approaches on asylum seekers may be found in breach of our obligations under the 1951 UN Convention, of which we are signatories. Meanwhile, the Refugee Council does a sterling job of supporting many desperate people coming to the UK, and if you can, please support them. See their website for donations if you're able to do so.
This is News for Scotland, week ending Friday 9th of February. It's news where we are. Hi, I'm Joe Murray. I turned 70 the other day, and all that is happening in the UK now is not just a temporary thing. The UK has been building up to this throughout my whole life. Way back, when there were some actual socialists in the Labour Party, they used public money for the public good. It was money Tories and rich people always believed was theirs by entitlement. Money they have spent 75 years working to get back from us plebs. Now they have. They won't ever let it go so easily again. This UK shit show they have created is not going away anytime soon. Your grandkids will be grannies themselves when it does, if it does, but more likely, it never will go away now. When the welfare state, including the National Health Service, is gone, it will never be coming back. There is not an iota of doubt in my mind about that. So with all that in the background, when Scotland is being regularly polled at 53% for indie, one has to ask, why isn't it 93%, 87%, 95%? I believe it's because Scots people are still listening to and watching the BBC. They still read the Herald and the Sun, the Daily Record, the Scotsman. You know, all those they know beyond doubt are lying to them, or at least dissembling, and that they said they were never ever going to read again, yet still they do. And it appears to affect how they think and act about Scottish independence. And right there is the battlefield the Union chose to protect itself. It's fought its fight well. Dirty tactics maybe, but winning is all that matters, and Scotland is an immense prize to the winners, be it them or be it us. Reading mainstream media, or listening to the BBC or ITV or Sky News or whatever, you might be forgiven for not knowing that one child in every four in Scotland lives in poverty. Well, some might forgive you, but I won't. For if more Scots had stopped listening to MSM negativity about Scotland, the polls for independence would be in the very high percentages now. But that is the job MSM set out to do, and they're very good at their job. We just need to stop listening to them. The I only read the Daily Mail for the comics or the sport pages simply doesn't cut it anymore. Why do you think they actually have these things in their newspapers anyway? It brings you in and then they give you what they want you to hear. While I understand the reticence of some indie folk due to lowish percentages, I think a wee bit more courage would see us through. I'll leave you with this, and I firmly believe this. If we do not give our children and grandchildren what they need with the stroke of a pen, they will end up having to go down that terrible and well-trodden road to independence that so many others have had to walk. That will be the legacy we leave them, and that will be unforgivable. Thank you for listening to News for Scotland. Next week we'll be taking a break, as it's half-term. However, you can tune in that weekend for our famous 1930s radio shows. As for News for Scotland, we'll see you in a fortnight. Have a nice half-term.